later.
Okay.
Here we go. So Lewis just arrived. Hi. Okay, it's connecting. Hi.
Hello.
Good evening. Okay.
Hi.
Good evening, Lois.
Just in time. We are beginning on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the top. I'm going to point out to you before that the previous Gemara said that there is, where my finger is, there are 7 sounds, sholosh kolors, that go from one end of the world to the other end of the world. One of them is koil neshama b'shah sheyotzei min haguf. The sound of a neshama as it departs the human body. Somehow there's a sound that goes from one end of the universe to another end of the universe. What that means, it's not clear from that. So, like I said, we're going to learn interesting things today that's relevant to, that has some alignment to what went on, to the current events. So, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, B'sha'ah sheYisrael oilu l'regel. When the Jewish people went up to oilu regel, that means they were in the Beis HaMikdash, there were such crowds in the Jewish people, oimdim tzufufim. Everybody was standing, floating. In other words, it's tzufufim means floating. How do you stand and float? So Rashi explains that people were so on top of each other that most people's feet didn't reach the ground. So therefore, it's as if you're floating. But when they would bow in the service of daven, there was all of a sudden space opened up, and everybody had like 4 amas with each other, like a distance of 4 amas. It's a nace. Look at Rashi. When they bowed and fell, a miracle happened. The Hamokoim space expanded. Machriv ad sheyesh b'neim arba amas. Why? Why did Hashem do that? A man should not listen into the confessions that his friend is talking to God privately. So he shouldn't be shamed. So therefore Hashem had to make it. Then the Brisa said, then Rabbi Yehuda Bar Rav said a thing that doesn't make sense. V'nim shachim, the people extended achas esrei ama achore beis hakaporos. They extended 11 amas behind the kaporos, which means they extended behind the building of the base HaMikdash in the back. So what is the Gemara? How does that relate to what he just said before, that they stood crowded and then they bowed they had space when they bowed, and then there were people extended to behind the kaporos, behind the heichal. My comma, what does he mean? Hachi comma. Even though the crowds were so large that they extended 11 amas behind the big building, and they were standing so crowded, one on top of each other. When they bowed with space. I'm pointing out to you, look at the picture on my screen. If this is the Heich Ulam, that means the T. This is the building of the T, right? And this is the Mizbeach. You came in over here. I want to point out that a Yisrael are not allowed to be in the Azara, the Ezra's Kahanim, by the Mizbeach. Only Kahanim allowed to be here. So where did the regular Jews stay if they wanted to get into the main sanctuary? They stood along the perimeter, all the way around, around this big building. That's called the Beis HaChalifos. And then the Gemara says behind the building where the Kodesh Kodashim is, there's 11 amas to the wall of the Beis HaMikdash. Even in that 11 amas, there were people there. And what the Gemara is trying to say is, when they wanted to bow, when they decided to bow, all the crowds would move to the Ezras Yisrael over here, and then they bowed towards the Heichal. So the crowds were standing over here the whole time. But then when it came to bowing, the crowds even crowded even further to be facing the Heichal and bowed this way. So that's what the Gemara said. And yet there was still space of Dalet Amas for everybody to bow. By the way, there were some people that thought that the Kaisel Maravi is where my blue thing, right behind. The Kaisel Maravi is over here somewhere. That's the Kaisel Marabi. Some people thought it was the back of the Kodesh Kedoshim, so they would never walk up to the Kaisel Marabi because they felt that's part of the base of Migdash. So some people would always be at a distance to the Kaisel, never touch the Kaisel, because they thought that the Kaisel Marabi was this wall over here. But we know it's this wall over here. And behind that is the base of Migdash. Behind that was that. So that was that. There's also a musar over here. The musar is that if a person is set in his ways, tzefufim, then you're crushed. In other words, if you're not flexible, then life is very difficult for a person. But but if you start bending, you're a little bit flexible in the wind, then ravachim, then you have life opens up for you. If you're so set in your ways, you're setting yourself up for a difficult time in life. You have to be bend a little bit. Now the Mishnah says, this is one of the 11 miracles that happened in the base of Mikdash. The Tanan, 11 miracles. The Tanan, we learned 10 miracles. Tanan, Asar Nisim Nasim base of Mikdash. The Mishnah says in Masechta Avos that there were 10 miracles that happened in the base of Mikdash. Miracle number 1. If a woman smelled the roasted meat or the meats that were cooking in the Beis HaMikdash, she never had a miscarriage. And the halacha is that if a woman smells delicious meat and she wants it, you have to give it to her because it's pekuach nefesh. So a woman walking around the Beis HaMikdash, there was no miscarriages there. They didn't have to give her the meat because it would be usher to give her kachim meat. So that was a miracle that no woman had a miscarriage, although they were around the Beis HaMikdash. And the B'sar HaKodesh never spoiled. There was no refrigeration. Now, remember, there's stuff that you brought onto the Mizbeach, right? There's meats that you brought onto the Mizbeach. Once you put it on the Mizbeach, even though you didn't put it in the fire, you have a couple of days to put it into the fire. You didn't have to put it into the fire that night because we hold Ein Lina. There's no overnight. Once you reach the top of the Mizbeach, that's the end zone. So a few days later, when you can imagine there's thousands and thousands of karbanos, it wasn't easy. So they left over something a couple of days later to throw it onto the fire. So it never spoiled, despite being on top of the Mizbeach. Then it says, where they slaughtered the meats, there was never found a fly in the Beis HaMikdash, in the slaughtering part of the Beis HaMikdash. And here, we said this many times before, there was the Kohen Gadol did not have a keri, which means that he did not have a seminal discharge b'yom Kippurim. Despite all the precautions that we took, that the Kohen Gadol couldn't eat this, he had to stay up the whole night and all that. Nevertheless, you needed a miracle that he didn't have keri, that he didn't have a seminal discharge, because the Yetzer Hara, the Satan, is very strong that night. And without divine intervention, the Kohen Gadol would have found himself tamei. There was never a disqualification ba'omer in the minchas ha'omer, uv'shtei alechem, and the shtei alechem that we brought on Shavuos, uv'lechem upon him, and the lechem upon him. In other words, these are types of things that must be done on that day. The omer had to be brought on the first day of Chol Hamoed Pesach. Shtei alechem was brought on Shavuos. Lechem upon him was every Shabbos. Now, once there was a psul, let's say a sheretz dropped on one while you're doing it, a sheretz dropped on the brand new breads that you're going to put on the shulchan. You couldn't bake a brand new bread on Shabbos. You couldn't break it. You couldn't do it again. So, and therefore, it was a possibility that you're going to skip the whole thing. So one of the nisim was that it never had a disqualification. And then the nace that we spoke about, when despite the crowds, that they would stay, people would stay crowded, and they would bow with space. Then the Mishnah says, there was never a snake or a scorpion that did damage in Yerushalayim to Olam. It bit, but it never hurt anybody. And that's an interesting thing. In Jerusalem, there's no snakes or scorpions. I once heard a story that when they were building Yamin Moshe, Yamin Moshe is a part right outside the walls. They weren't sure if that has a din of Yerushalayim or not. There was a big question on that. And the rabbi there was Rabbi Yisrael Salant. He was the rabbi in the early 1900s. And what happened was that a kid got bitten by a snake over there. Oh, so for there, he understood that was he decided based on that psak that part is not part of the original Yerushalayim, because we have here a Nachash and Akrav cannot do something never. It can never happen. Somebody has a snake bite or a damaging snake bite or scorpion bite in Yerushalayim. It still exists till today. A man didn't say to his friend, two people living in Jerusalem don't say, it's so I can't make a living here in Yerushalayim. Or I have, Rashi says, dirasi, it's too crowded. My living crowded. I have too dirasi dichuka. It's too crowded in my apartment. That never existed in Yerushalayim. It's also an ace. People are happier there. So those are the 10 miracles. So the Gemara says, you gave me 8 miracles that happened in the Beis Hamikdash. And you told me there's 10 miracles that happened in the Beis Hamikdash. The last 2 happened in Jerusalem. You started off saying these things happened in the Beis Hamikdash, and you ended off with 2 that was a miracle that happened in Jerusalem. But we're looking for 10 that happened only in the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says, yes, there's 2 others miracles that happened in the Beis Hamikdash. The Tanya, what's the 2 other miracles? The fire that was on the Mizbeach did not get extinguished. In other words, although it rained in Jerusalem and the Beis Hamikdash doesn't have a roof, the fire never went out over there. That's one. It's a big miracle. But Ashan Hamarocha, and the smoke that comes from the fire, from the pyre, never afilu kol harucha sheba'olam boyus u'manashus boy. Even all the winds in the world will come and try to blow it. Ein mezizes oisem emkoimah. It doesn't blow it. It doesn't move from its place. It goes straight up. So that's another miracle. So you have 2 more miracles that happened specifically in the Beis Hamikdash. Says the Gemara of Asu Leika. Are there no other miracles that happened in the Beis Hamikdash? Well, Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Rab Shmaya B'Kalbanoi, Rab Shmaya from Kalbanavoy, he said like this: Shivrei klei cheres nivloim im koimam. The broken pieces of pottery in the Beis Hamikdash got swallowed into the ground. Now they would cook meat in the Beis Hamikdash, right? You only can eat that meat for a day and a night. Afterwards, the meat becomes noiser. That's treif, right? You can't eat noiser. So when you cooked it in a pottery pot, that the blias went into the walls of the klicheres. The taste, some of the substance of that meat went into the walls of the klicheres. So that klicheres, that earthenware pot, had to be destroyed. So they would break the piece of pottery in the Beis Hamikdash. Now imagine breaking pieces of pottery and you have Kahanim walking barefoot. So the miracle was that the pottery, as soon as you broke it, it got swallowed up. It dissolved into the ground of the Beis Hamikdash. So that's another miracle that happened.
That's not the only thing that was absorbed. Also, the ashes.
That's the next Gemara's question.
Yeah,
excellent question.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about one of the activities that you could do in Israel is go on an archaeological dig.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did it with my kids, and it was fantastic, and you find something, pieces of pottery to be discovered, and it's all over Israel, but it's a good activity. Anyway, Abaya said what you just said, Sheldon. The crop and the feathers of the birds that they were makriv, that they peeled that off, they didn't put it on the mizbeach, and the ashes of the inside mizbeach, the ashes of the outside mizbeach, and the menorah, they put it in a certain place. So they put it in a certain place. If so, you have 2 things. You have 2 things over here. So the Gemara says, Pisule Tlosa and Hava. You're right. This one, you have 2 more things you can add. So this thing, we need to disqualify these 3 things are counted as 1. So that's, although it's 3, chashvina lechad, let's count that as 1. Apik tray, va'ayel tray. You take out 2 and you put in 2. So in other words, you take out 2 because those things are counted as one, and you put in the klicheres that got swallowed into the ground, and the ashes of the mizbeach that also got swallowed into the ground. So the Gemara says, with your logic, you should count the swallowing as one nace. These two things are basically the same idea, that the broken earthenware pottery was swallowed in the ground, and the ashes of the mizbeach were also swallowed in the ground by nace. So that should be counted as one. So basically, you're missing one. You're missing one more nace. So the Gemara says, "Ikanami, there was one more nace that we didn't. Ikanami achrite. There's one more nace." The Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, "Nace gadol." I don't know what this means. Nace gadol was a big nace. Hoya nasa belechem upon him. A great nace happened with the lechem upon him. Why? You baked it on Friday. You put it onto the shulchan on Shabbos, and you didn't take it off till the next Shabbos, and it was still piping hot. Seluke, when you took it off, is kisudure, like you put it on. It was still the same softness, texture, and piping hot. Shenema, losid, lechem, you placed bread, chaim, which was hot, and it stayed that way beyond hilakhay when you took it off. It's a darshan of a pasuk in Shmuel Aleph. So that was another nace. So now you have number 10. I don't know why it calls it a nace gadol, like a big nace. Others were smaller naceim. That nace, that you made it, it was soft and hot. The Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says is counted as a big nace. So now we have 10. So the Gemara says v'suleka, whether there's not another miracle that happened in the base of Mikdash. We have a tradition, that the place of the Aron is not counted. In other words, the width of the Kodesh Kedoshim, this width of the Kodesh Kedoshim was 20 amas. And from the walls of the Aron, each side, there was 10 amas to one side and 10 amas to the other side. Yet, if that's the case, the Aron doesn't take up space. So how's that possible? The box itself has to take up space. How can you say from the side of the box on each side is 10 amas? That's the tradition. So we have a tradition that the Aron never took up any space. What that means, I don't know, but it didn't take up space. But Amar Rabbanoi, Amar Shmuel, Keruvim b'nei soya oimdim. The Keruvim that Shlomo HaMelech made was also standing with the nace. The Keruvim that Shlomo HaMelech made is not the Keruvim that you're familiar with. It was these humongous birds, so to speak, that faced out, and the wing covered the whole width of the temple, but the body itself is not even counted as part of that. The wingspan was 10 amas each, and yet you're not counting the bird itself. So again, there's things going on in that Kodesh Kedoshim that seem to defy physics, that the things are there, but it's not taking up space. So that was also another two miracles. So the Gemara answers a simple answer. Nisan de broy kachashav. Nisan that the general population could observe, that's what we're counting. Nisan de gavoy, Nisan that happened inside the Kodesh Kedoshim, that only the Kohen Gadol goes there. Like kachashav, that we don't count. So the Gemara says, if according to your logic, lechem upon nisi de gavoyhu. The lechem upon him, the hot show bread, was also in the heichal. That's where you kept it. Not everybody saw it. It was also in this room over here, the heichal. People are always over here. They didn't get to see that. The Gemara says yes. In fact, we're going to learn that lechem upon him, answers the Gemara, nisin de broihu. The lechem upon him, everybody got to see it. Why? Because they actually took the table out of the heichal and showed it to the people. Taste, touch it. See how it's smoking hot. So the Amar of Shlakish says, "My diksiv." Why does it say regarding the table al hashulchan hatahar, the table that was pure, tar mechlal shuklame, a tar that this table could become tame. That's what. Why could a table become tame? Kli eitz. We go to Amud Beis. Kli eitz ha'asu l'nachasu. It's a kli eitz. It's a wooden kalim that you don't move. If you have let's say a bookshelf or something like that you don't move it, it can never become tamei. If the shulchan they never moved out of the heichal, why does the Torah say that it's tar and it could become tamei? Any kli that's stationary and you never move it, like a big armoire, it's not makabel tumah. The chaytz is b'fnei tumah. Actually, it's a partition in front of tumah. Something that it itself cannot be makabel tumah. Actually, it could be a dividing wall between a tomei and that. If there's a mace behind it, you have this big wooden furniture, it can actually block the tumah from going. So, Ella, what do we see from there? That the shulchan was exactly you moved it. They would actually lift it and bring it out to where the Jewish people were staying. And they brought it out on Yom Tiv. See how much God loves you. When you take it off, that's the way it was put on. You put bread, it was still hot, and the day you took it. So they actually moved the bread. So that's why it's a type of nace that everybody saw. But Masha Enkein, on the other hand, the nace that happened in the Kodesh Kedoshim, nobody got to see that nace. That's not counted. So Gemara is now going, one more nace. V'su Leika. Is there not one more nace that happened in the Beis Hamikdash? This, what the Gemara says, seems like a fairy tale over here. Lahavdol. But listen what the Gemara says. Amar Rabbi Shai says, Peshah Shabon Shlomo Beis Hamikdash. When Shlomo built the temple, not the boy, Kol Mini Megadim Shel Zav. He planted trees of gold. And the trees, he planted gold in the ground and they grew trees. And the fruit that came out was a gold fruit. They actually gave off fruit in the season. When the wind would blow, they would fall off the tree. And the point was that the Kahanim were able to pick up gold off those trees, and they had a living from that. It was like all b'derech nes. Kshenamar yirash kalavonim period, that it made such a noise like the trees that were in the Lebanon. Lebanon is another name of the Beis Hamikdash fruit. It made a ruckus. When the Babylonians came, presumably to destroy the first Beis Hamikdash, Yavesh, those trees dried up. Shenama uferach levonin umlo. The blossom of those Lebanon trees, those Beis Hamikdash trees, another name for the Beis Hamikdash is Lebanon. Umlo got dried up. But don't worry. God will eventually bring back those trees. Shenama proyach tifrach v'sogel. It will definitely blossom again, and you'll be singing from joy. Afkiles v'raning kvoid halavonim. In other words, when the Mashiach will come, the same honor that was originally in the first Beis Hamikdash will come back again, and there'll be great joys, great singing and shouting of joy from those trees that are going to grow. The bottom line is, there's one more nace we forgot to count. Those trees that gave off gold apples, so to speak, that were in the Beis Hamikdash, how come that's not counted? And for the Gemara, Nisi de Kavila Kachashev. That nace stayed in one place. It happened with the same tree. So therefore, that's not counted. The showbread or any other nace is not a nace that happened in one place. Every week they had a different bread over there that remained hot for a week. So that's why that nace is counted, but the nace of the growing of the gold trees doesn't exist. So the Gemara says, so if you come with that teretz, with that logic, the things that are always there, that never change, it was a nace in one spot. The fact that your question was, why don't we count that the Oren didn't take up space, or the Cherubim didn't take up space? Why don't we count that nasim? So we said the teretz was because that's a nace that nobody gets to see. But now I'm giving you another answer. That's a nisei dikviya ninu. It's a nace that happens to one Oren, one Cherubim. Unlike the other nasim that happen to different people, let's say the nace that no pregnant woman miscarried in the Beis Hamikdash. That could be many different pregnant women had this nace happen to them. Those are the kind of nisim we are counting in that number. Next, Amomar. We learned previously. There was smoke in the Maracha. So the Gemara asked, it never went up, right? The smoke of the Maracha went straight up. So the Gemara says, Mi hava ashim b'Maracha. Was there smoke on top of the Mizbeach? Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Chamisha Dvarim Nema Be'esh Maracha. 5 things were said by the fire on the Mizbeach, right? Revutza ka'ari. In other words, this fire fell from heaven in a form of a coal. When Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash, a coal dropped from heaven and it looked like a crouching lion. So imagine this big coal looking like a crouching lion. And that fire that came out of the heavenly fire that dropped onto the Mizbeach, Ubara Kechama, it was clear like the sun, whatever that means. The Yeshba Mamish, and you could actually had a substance to it. It wasn't like a gas, it actually, you could touch it. And it doesn't matter. It would consume moist and dry things. It doesn't matter. It would not be extinguished if it came on to something that was wet. The Eina Mal Asham, and that never gave off smoke. So we see the smoke that was on the Mizbeach never gave off smoke. So yeah, right. That was the heavenly fire that was on the Mizbeach. Ki Kamrina, when do we say there was smoke? When we would have to make a fire. Because there's a pasuk that says in Parshas Vayikra, the time you have v'nosnu b'nei Aharon ha'kohanim eish al hamizbeach, afal pi she'eish yoredus min hashamayim mitzvah lahavim min hahedin. Even though God somehow brought a fire from heaven and that never went out, and that coal always remained on the mizbeach, there's a mitzvah every day to bring wood with fire onto the mizbeach. That wood, that fire that humans brought, that was on the mizbeach, that had a smoky texture to it, and it smoked up. One thing the Gemara asked, the side point, you said in the first Beis HaMikdash that coal looked like Revutza Ka'ari. It was crouching like a lion. But Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, I saw the fire on the Mizbeach, Revutza Kekelev. It looked like a sitting dog. It looked like Otto or something like that. A dog sitting. So the Gemara says, so was it looking like a lion, or did the fire look like a dog? So loy kasha, kan b'mikdash rishon. In the first Beis HaMikdash, it observed like a lion. Kan b'mikdash sheni, in the second Beis HaMikdash, it looked like a dog. So the Gemara says, b'mikdash sheni mi haboy. Was there a fire that fell from heaven in the second Beis HaMikdash? I always thought that the second Beis HaMikdash was not as holy as the first Beis HaMikdash. But Amar Shmuel bar Inya, my diksiv, what does it say in the pasuk? Be'ertz boy, and I'll be appeased. Be'ekaved, I will be honored. And it should say Ikavda. God said, build me the Beis HaMikdash and I will be honored. But we read it, we read it, God will be honored. But it's actually, when it's written out in the Chumash, in the Tanakh, in Chagai, it's missing a hey. It's missing the letter hey. It's pronounced Ikavda, but it's actually missing that letter hey. Why, when the Chagai talks about the second Beis HaMikdash, that God's presence is going to be there, it says that the word is missing the letter hey. It's letter because the first Beis HaMikdash was -5. The second Beis HaMikdash was -5 from the first Beis HaMikdash. 5 things were missing in the second Beis HaMikdash. 5 things were missing. These are they: Oren, the Kaparis, the Kruvim. There was no Oren in the second Beis HaMikdash. There was no Kaparis, no Kruvim. Eish, there was no fire from heaven. Oh, that's your question. Ushchina, God's presence wasn't in the second Beis HaMikdash, which is not so clear. V'ruach HaKodesh, there was no prophecy. V'urim v'tumin, and the Kohen Gadol's Urim v'tumin didn't work. Usually you would be able to ask the Kohen Gadol, should we go to war, should we not go to war? And his breastplate would light up. That didn't work in the second Beis HaMikdash. So we see that there was no fire coming from heaven during the second Beis HaMikdash. So how could you say that in the second Beis HaMikdash they had a fire, but it looked like a dog? It didn't look like a lion. So the Gemara says, Amri en miyahava. There was a fire that came down from the second Beis HaMikdash. Sayu Eloi Messiah, but it did not work as well in the second Beis HaMikdash. It didn't burn up any of the sacrifices, but it was there in a fire somehow from heaven during the second temple. Finally, the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanan taught, there's 6 types of fire in the Jewish world that exist. Some fires, like the fire that we know, consumes, but it can't consume liquid. That means water could extinguish the fire. So it eats but cannot drink. There's some fires that could drink, but doesn't burn. There's some fires that could eat and burn solids and liquids. One can eat moist like dry. One fire could push away another fire. V'yesh eish oicheles. And one fire, it is sometimes in Tanakh, fire consumes fire. So this price is a mystery. So let's see. Yesh eish oicheles ve'ein shoysa. You said number one, there's a fire that can eat and doesn't drink. In other words, hadidan, that's a regular fire. That a regular fire can burn, but you could douse it with water and it goes out. So it cannot drink. It can only consume. Shoysa ve'ein oicheles, a fire that makes a person can eat liquids but doesn't consume the person, doesn't burn. That's the chulin, the fire of fever. Fever makes a person's liquids dry up on the inside but doesn't burn the person himself. It just takes away the liquids. So that's a type of fire. What's a fire that eats and can eat and drink? That's the fire that happened in Tanakh by Eliyahu. The water that was in the trench, got licked up by this fire. If you have to learn Tanakh, but basically there's a thing that Eliyahu Hanavi brought to make a point about God, brought a fire from heaven that not only consumed sacrifices but consumed water too, to prove that it was a heavenly fire. There's a fire in Tanakh that would eat moist and dry things. The maracha, the fire that was on the mizbeach would actually eat wet meat and dry wood. It doesn't matter. It was a heavenly fire. Sometimes fire could push away fire. The Gabriel. That's the story about Gabriel, where Gabriel is the Malach Ha'esh. Gabriel is the fiery Malach. And one time God told him that, they put Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in, they threw them into a furnace fire, and he got burnt alive. And they were going to get burnt alive. And God sends Gabriel to cool off the fire. So Gabriel, who's made up of fire, was actually cooling off the fire of the Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And sometimes fire could consume other fire. The Shechina, God, who was made of fire, so to speak, consumed other fire. He consumed malachim. In other words, when God was creating the world, the malachim were trying to convince him out of it. He said, "This is a bad idea. What's the benefit of having humans and mankind?" So God, the Omamar, Hoishet Etzboi Beneim Usrafim. So God, so to speak, stuck his finger between the malachim that were trying to prevent God from creating the planet Earth, and burned up those malachim. Okay, one other thing. Ba'ashan HaMaracha. Here's fascinating Gemara. The smoke of the mizbeach would rise up. No, all the winds in the world will never be able to blow it off its direction. So the Gemara says, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, on the last day of Shmini Atzeres, right? The Shmini Atzeres, everybody's saying goodbye to go home. Everybody would look to the smoke that was on the mizbeach. If it bended towards the north, that means there's a southerly wind blowing. So then the smoke bent towards north. Everybody knew this was their weather forecasting. They knew that it's going to be a year of tremendous rain and tremendous crop, and therefore Aniyim Smechem, the poor people, were happy because they figured that there's going to be a food in abundance that next year. Ubalibatim, the owners of the farm at Savin, were sad because there's going to be such an oversupply, they're not going to hardly be able to make a living. They didn't have the American government buying it below and making them lose money, even though they were losing money. So they were going to be very sad. Because there's a lot of rain, and also because there's a lot of rain, you can't store anything away. So the fruits that you're going to store, markivim, would become rot. Now, if the people started predicting the weather patterns for the upcoming winter, so they looked at the marocha, the smoke that's coming out of the mizbeach, and they saw not the klapi darim. If it was bending towards the south, that means there's a northerly wind blowing. Aniyim atzevim ubalibatim smechem. Then the poor people were sad, and the balabatim were the owners of the farm were very happy because that's a sign. There's going to be very little rain. It's a dry wind. And the fruits will be preserved. So there's very little supply, much less supply, and you could store the fruits. So the owners of the fields would be very happy, but the poor people were sad. Not the klape mizrach, but if they saw that the smoke bent towards the east, that means there's a westerly wind blowing. Hakol smeichen, everybody was happily. These are westerlies, and because that's a balanced wind. There's a lot of rain, but yet you could store things, you could preserve things. So it's a balanced type of wind, and that's a good weather prediction. Klape Marev, but if everybody saw that the smoke on the Mizbeach was bending towards west, that means there's an easterly wind. That means Hakol Atzevin, everybody was very sad because it's not so balanced. So it was because these easterly winds are very, very dry, and nothing grows. So here ends the question. You see that the ashen, the smoke on the Mizbeach, actually curved to the right, to the left, north, south, east, west, and that's how they predicted the weather for the winter. So how could you tell me in our Mishnah that the smoke on the Mizbeach never deviated? It went straight up. And for the Gemara, I agree with you. The also kedikli, it went straight up like a stick. But if Durei loy have a mivder, but it didn't disperse. In other words, it went like a stick, but it could bend like a stick. So it didn't disperse like regular smoke. It went straight in a line, but it could bend in the four directions. And finally, the Gemara concludes. And again, this Gemara has to do with predicting weather patterns, and they had to know what the global winds, the trade winds, the easterly winds. This was a big issue in ancient times. So Amar Mar, you told me that Klape Mizrach, if it's bending towards east, that means a westerly wind is blowing. Hakol Smeichen. Westerly winds, everybody's good, everybody's happy. Klape Mar, if the smoke bent towards the west, that means easterly winds blow. That means Hakol Atzevin. Everybody is sad. So east is bad, west is good, right? So the Urminu, I'll ask you a question. You tell me east is bad. The Brisa says Mizrachas, east winds, Lo'ilam Yafa, are always good. Ma'aravis, westerly winds, Lo'ilam Kasha, are bad winds. Ruch Tzafainis, a northerly wind, that's good for certain types of crops. Yafa Lechitim, it's good for wheat. B'shal Shavi Shlish, when it's ripened for a third, a north wind is good. The Kasha L'Dei Seisim, B'zman Shein Chaitim. And it's very difficult, these type of winds, for zaysim. Zaysim are olives. So northerly winds are good for wheat, but not good for olives. Ruach Toroim is south, Kasha L'Chitim, is very bad for wheat, when it started to become ripe. The Yafa L'Zaysim, but it's beautiful for olives, B'zman Shein Chaitim. If you want to remember the north wind and the south wind, what's it good for? Look at the Heichal. A way to remember this, Shulchan, when you walked into the Beis HaMikdash, the table with the 12 breads, B'tzafin, always appeared in the north. That means it was good for bread. The north is always good. The north winds were always good for wheat. Umenorah, but the menorah was Badarim. The lamps were in the south, on the left side. So therefore, that reminds you that olives, south winds are good for olives. Hi Marbi today, this is good for its one. Hi Marbi today, this is good for it. But why do we bring this in? Because you told me that if a westerly winds, everybody happy. Easterly winds, everybody sad. And this Brisa says just the opposite. Easterly winds are good. Westerly winds are bad. So the Gemara says, Loi Kasha, that's not difficult. Halon v'halahu. Oh, in Eretz, it depends where you live. An easterly wind is always good in Babylon. Dry winds are much better in Babylon. Why? Because that Babylon is a very moist climate, a very wet climate over there. And therefore, everything gets saturated. So therefore, it's very good to have a dry wind. In Eretz Yisrael, you have the opposite. And therefore, east winds are good for Babylon. Halahu, but Eretz Yisrael, they need the rain. So they're better off having a westerly wind, because that's Eretz Yisrael is a place of mountains and valleys, and therefore everything dries out faster. Westerly winds are good. Here in the United States, our weather pattern, by the way, goes from west to east. And that has to do with the way the world moves. And you see that from this Gemara that at that time, everybody was nervous going home from the Beis HaMikdash after Sukkot, and they started to predict the weather patterns based on how the smoke on the Mizbeach tilted. Very fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Excellent.
Okay. lot to learn today.
Excellent.
Okay,
Wonderful
very-
Daf. Excellent.
Okay.
Shkoyach.
It's Shem tomorrow. Good night.
Good night.